So this week's topic is interpersonal information environments. What that is just sort of what are the things that you're hearing about politics when you talk with people about politics, either in person, on the phone, I suppose through text messages. And so what's the information you're getting from these sort of more traditional forms of communication about politics? A question that comes out of that is essentially sort of like, why are we talking about politics? Okay, what is the purpose of talking about politics? And then do we self-censor? What do we say when we're speaking? And both in terms of like, how much are we talking to sort of become friends with people? How much are we unwilling to share things that we think people might not like? So to talk about sort of those issues and some other things, I had Skyped, put on these headphones, and Skyped with Professor Jamie Settle of the College of William & Mary. Now, she's co-author of one of the articles for this week, written a book that you're going to be reading a bit of later on. And so we talked about, and some other pieces too. And so we talked about sort of interpersonal communication. We talked about some online communication. We spoke for about an hour, and you'll be seeing bits of that conversation throughout the semester, with her speaking on one side of the screen and me awkwardly listening on the other side. Just like, yeah. So that's that. And so so in this video, we're going to take the bits of that conversation that I had with her about interpersonal communications. Then in the next video that you'll see, this is just me talking about essentially, really, can we learn things about politics from the people who are providing information to us about politics, right? The people who are providing information to us about politics typically care about politics and probably have some policy positions that they really care about. And they might have some biases, and there might be biased sources. And can you learn anything from biased sources? And you actually can, though the specifics are, the situations, the contexts are very specific. And so we'll talk about that. And it basically gets us at this idea where can you take a bunch of people who don't really care that much about politics on average, don't necessarily know that much about politics. They know the basics. Typically, most people know the basics about politics: who's the president, Congress, and that sort of thing. That Congress exists. Not much about what goes on, but right, they understand that we have a government and here's the basic structure of it. But they don't know much more than that. But there's some people who know a lot about politics, and those people tend to care a lot about politics. And so, how does the sort of interaction of these different type of people? What kind of information do we get as a whole? After those people communicate, okay? In what situations is communication better, or is it possible that communication is actually worse? So that's that second video. And the third video clip is a bit from, I think it was Nova, but it's a PBS show talking about something I mentioned in the other video called The Wisdom of the Crowds. And they do a silly song, a very silly song about what it is. So that's that third video. So this is about a few minutes of my conversation with Professor Jamie Settle about interpersonal communication. Okay, why do you think people talk about politics?
Well, I think the thing to keep in mind is that there's a bunch of different reasons, and it's going to depend on the person, and it's going to depend on the context, and it's going to depend what's happening in the world. Some people treat politics like sports, right? So you could ask the same question, why do people talk about sports? They just find it interesting. They find it engaging. They like hearing what other people have to say. They like the opportunity to share their own opinions. But if you don't like sports, you find these conversations completely boring and difficult to follow, and you probably don't even understand why the sports lovers want to be talking in such detail about all these sports things. Politics is really similar to that. I mean, there are going to be some people who just love the whole notion of the power, the politics, the policy, the players, so to speak. They find it interesting, and they want to hear what others have to say. They want to share their opinions. They want to get a sense for sort of where their opinion falls within the distribution of the people they know. Then there are going to be people who avoid talking about politics at all costs. They find it boring, they find it uncomfortable, it might produce anxiety in them for a whole bunch of different reasons. And so they'll do their best to shy away from having any sort of conversation. And then most people probably fall somewhere in the middle. They're okay talking about politics in some situations, maybe right before an election. They think it's important to be informed and understand, but they don't like politics enough to want to be talking about it or thinking about it when they don't have to be.
Do you think when people talk about politics, their goal is consensus seeking, argumentation, or is that a mix as well?
It's probably a mix, but most of the time, I don't necessarily think it's consensus like we think of it in terms of deliberation. Most people do talk about politics with people who share the same opinions. I'm really interested in figuring out how people know that ahead of time, if it's not someone that they know particularly well. So they're going into a conversation likely already knowing that the people they're about to talk with probably agree with them. So that it's not building consensus in the terms of let's start from different places and all arrive at the same location. But it can feel really good to have your opinions validated, to know that your opinions make you part of a group, to understand what other members of your group think, to see if you also believe those things. So with like-minded others, I would say that, yeah, people are kind of building consensus in an identity sense. What is it that people like us think and feel and believe about politics? For disagreeable conversations, I think that's really personality dependent. I don't think that people necessarily assume they're going to persuade others to change their minds, though they might try. Some people just like to argue, right? They just like that sort of cut and thrust and going back and forth. Others probably have deeply felt moral convictions about certain political things and maybe feel obligated to try and persuade others of their viewpoints. But I would say that in our contemporary culture, the idea of arriving at some sort of mutually agreed upon consensus, if you're starting at really different viewpoints, is probably not what most people are after.
There are two types of questions one could ask about sports. And those questions are, for example, who's playing in the Super Bowl or who won the Super Bowl, or who should I root for in the Super Bowl? Yeah. Which do you think people try and do with politics?
I think the stakes are enough different in politics that it's probably more of the latter. I think the people who are interested enough in politics to want to be talking about it for the most part are going to know the answers about who's playing and who, what game are we in, so to speak. You could imagine some situations maybe ahead of an election where there are a lot of ballot initiatives and you haven't been following everything, and maybe then even someone who's interested in politics could try to just want to map the lay of the land about what we're talking about. Most of the time, though, I think it is, who should I be cheering for? And the reason is that we all get to play the sport of politics as opposed to other sports where you really are purely a spectator. And I think that expectation in politics that as a good citizen, you're supposed to have opinions and that you're supposed to vote if you're eligible to do so, those mean that you have to know which side you're supposed to be cheering for.